Hi everyone, I am Rose. I'll just, let's see. Actually, I'll turn my video on for you guys after. So thank you so much, Erin, for having me here into the AEF as well. And that was a lovely intro, so thank you. Like Erin had said, we're just gonna kind of dive into a few different parts of saddle fitting today that you can probably take home and use with you when you're shopping for your own saddles or when you're checking your own saddles. And we're going to talk about like how horses can change and develop and what like good saddle fit means, you know, for the longevity of your horse's career. So without much more, I would say we'll just dive into it. So we had kind of gone over this a bit before, but we definitely are going to look at the effects of saddle fit and the basics of saddle fit as well. So, you know, those are definitely the things that you can take home to use with you when you're checking your own saddles and, you know, working with friends or shopping for saddles. We'll talk a little bit about the different tools that fitters will use to measure a horse's back and to sort of help a little bit predict change. Obviously, like it's all taken, you know, we try and do our best, but with the tools available, and then like how that can kind of feed into the development in horses' backs. And then I think it's also really important to sort of touch base on like how to find great saddles. So we'll talk a bit about that. And at the end of the day, what it all boils down to for you, yourself, like your horse and your coach. So yeah. Okay, so in the first section, what we'll do is we're going to look at the effects of saddle fit, some key terms that we're going to use a few times today, and basic equine anatomy. And so as Erin said, my name is Rose, and I'm definitely more than happy to field any questions for you guys at the end of this session. I have a master's of veterinary medicine and equine reproduction. I did some time with the UFC, with Devaku, I've coached a little, and I started CommonWealth after working for Devaku for quite a while, and we work with Amerigo and Mayer as well as Leveza. So, and we do a lot of consignment too, which is actually not on here. So I think it's really important that people know, you know, a big part of our program is educating people. And I think it's important to know, to sort of be able to stand on your own 2 feet for your horses, because you might not always have access to people within your area. And so it's good to have knowledge. Okay, so essentially, and I think that we all know this, but the overarching effect of a good saddle fit is longevity and performance. So a saddle is not going to save your horse from blowing a tendon, but it definitely is, you know, with the combination of proper coaching and proper riding, going to help your horse last in performance longer. And essentially the end goal of that is to create balance, comfort, and effectiveness of riders, and that delivers itself in terms of movement, fluidity, and impulsion. So a horse with a comfortable saddle is going to move more effectively and almost with a greater range of movement as well as freedom of movement. And if we're impeding them less and causing them to have less compensation, then they're not going to develop those injuries that sometimes creep up really slowly. Because they're moving the way that they are built to move. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure they're comfortable, and that translates to movement. Okay, when we look at the basic anatomy of horses, so this top horse up here, well, I guess we'll talk about muscles first. So this is, I believe, actually from a human skeleton, but the muscles are the same on a horse as they are on a person. So right here, so this is the scapula on a horse. And this one, contrary to, maybe not to belief, but like a lot of people don't think about this, but the scapula is actually not attached to the horse's rib cage by anything more than ligaments and muscles, which means that it can arch this way. It can come more up, it can come more sideways, it can come more out. So the movement of the horse's shoulder blade is very individual to each horse. And because we have a saddle that sits right here, that is going to be really important in how we fit saddles. So if you hear me say scapula, that means shoulder blade, and just keep in mind that each horse's shoulder blade, and per horse and per side, the shoulder blade can move differently. Next, we'll talk about the longissimus dorsi. So that's this muscle that runs down. So on your own back, it's that big muscle that runs the length of your back. And on horses, it runs kind of from there to there. So that's sort of where the saddle panels would sit on a horse. And that's really important because we want to have effective development of, like, when we talk about top line, we're talking about the longissimus dorsi in a horse. And we want to make sure that that is developing comfortably and that there's no sort of muscle atrophy caused by high pressure points or compensation from avoiding certain pressure points, right? Next, the traps. So the trapezius is actually, it's located on horse right behind the shoulder blade. And that's, a lot of times you'll see on a horse, sometimes horses have pockets behind their shoulder blades. That can be, you know, a lack of development of the trap. And so that also is going to play into how we fit a saddle to each horse. The girthing groove, very few times do we ever talk about the girthing groove. So the girthing groove is right there. And it's a lot of times, like, it's a natural deviation in the horse's skeleton. And then it is either it can be increased with high pressure girths. So that's something that is really important to look into, and we're going to talk about it more later. But it's located right there. Some horses will have a really high girthing groove, so they'll have it like almost beneath the elbow, like and forward in front of it. And some horses will have it pretty far back. And how that plays into the overall stability of the saddle and like the movement of the saddle, like from sliding back or slipping forward, that has to do with your girth a lot. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit because it's a big point in saddle fitting. Thoracic lumbar. So that would be all of these guys up here, okay? And the horse has 18 thoracic lumbar. 5 of those are in the wither, okay? We in saddle fitting tend to talk a lot about T13, okay, which is the, on paper, the only vertebra that stands up straight in a horse's back, which means it's the only load-bearing joint in a horse's back, okay? Each vertebra is considered a joint. However, as long as we're centered around T13, so if we're sitting here, our point of knee is here and our leg is here, then we're centered around that mostly load-bearing joint, right? If we're further back, then we're sitting on a pivoting axis, which can later cause problems down here. So we can definitely dive into that a bit more in questions after. I don't think I go into it too much more in this PowerPoint. So without much more of a further ado, I just wanted to throw in here that there's a lot of different ways to fit saddles. So just because you necessarily hear something in this PowerPoint that another person has maybe said differently, it doesn't mean that they're wrong or that we're wrong. There's different ways to do things. We fit for competitive sport, so ease of movement, effectiveness, and then the long-term health and well-being of horse and rider. But like I said, there are lots of different ways to do things. And definitely if you have questions and if you're working with people and you don't understand something or you maybe aren't on the same page as them, like ask them to explain it more. And by all means, you know, as a rider, you know your horse the best. And so, you know, it's definitely good to, you know where you stand with the knowledge that you have, and don't be afraid to question a bit because it's important to understand things fully. So, okay, so the basics of saddle fit. So what we're gonna look for when we're saddle shopping or testing our own saddles. And I kind of break it up into just a few simple points for people to take home. There is gonna be a handout after available to you guys. So feel free to post it in your barns or, you know, wherever you think it'll be of most use to you. But we're gonna talk about wither clearance, spinal clearance, panel contact, panel pressure and tree points, a little bit on static and motion fits, the movement of the saddle, girths, and then of course, rider's position. So wither clearance. When we talk about wither clearance, what we are going to talk about is basically, you know how when you put a saddle on the horse's back, you don't want it to sit on their wither. So that's wither clearance. So that would be right in here. Can you guys see my mouse? I don't know, Erin?
Yes, everyone can see, yeah.
Perfect. So ideally, you want 3 to 4 fingers throughout the whole length of the saddle, okay? And that would be about 4 centimeters, okay? Because the horse has to have the ability to relax that longissimus dorsi, so that long muscle that runs along the back, which will actually cause the saddle to drop, and it has to have the ability to lift it, so it causes the whole saddle to come up, okay? We say it's kind of borderline when you only have 2 to 3 centimeters between, and that's in your static and your motion. So so when I talk about a static fit, that's on the horse when we're in the cross ties with the horse, looking at saddles on their bare back. And then your motion fit is when you're in the saddle riding around. So do be careful that just because it fits in a static doesn't mean it's going to fit in a motion. And when you're in the saddle, a lot of saddles will sink. So three fingers, when you're going around, usually that's okay. Ideally, you want a little more. And more than that, it usually means your saddle is too narrow. So wither clearance, really important. And make sure you check, from head to tail, that there's that 3 to 4 fingers throughout the whole saddle, okay? The next thing we're going to talk about is spinal clearance. So I'll just jump back here for a second. So if this is the horse's spine and you look at this panel down lengthwise, okay, spinal clearance is the amount of space between the spine and the panel, okay? So the way that we look at that is, so if you have your first check, it's 3 to 4 fingers at the horse's wither and down the whole spine. The next one, you're going to take your thumb and index and put it between the panels and the horse's spine. So a finger right here and right there, and then you're gonna wiggle the saddle side to side. And what you're gonna see is is that panel comfortable touching your spine or touching your fingers, right? Is it too tight? Is there not enough room? Is it too far off the spine? Okay, those are all really important questions that you have to ask as to how the saddle is going to interact with your horse's back, okay? If you have bare tree, and when I say bare tree, so this part, touching the horse's spine on either side of it, it's very, very uncomfortable. And that is like a pretty big no-no, okay? It has to be panel that comes into contact with your horse at about 1 centimeter out or so, maybe even 2 centimeters. You don't wanna crush the spine on the side, so the clearance on the side has to be ample, in terms of there has to be enough room. It can be, it doesn't have to be a huge amount. If it's a huge amount, you can run into problems too, but you don't want it to crush your fingers, that's for sure. So yeah, and I just wiggle the saddle a little when I do that. And sort of ask yourself the question, could you keep your fingers there comfortably for an hour? And would it hurt your fingers? And if it, in general, with saddle fitting, if you don't think your own fingers could handle it for an hour, the chances are your horse's back can't either. Because as much as they're big, ginormous creatures that, run around and jump meter 40s and do canter pirouettes, they're also really sensitive beings, right? They can sense a fly on them and they have these fast twitch muscles. So it's really important to make sure that they're comfortable, and an easy way to measure that is if you think you would be comfortable by putting your own fingers in the space that they have to interact with, okay? Not the whole time, but just to check every once in a while, right? Yeah, okay. So again, we're gonna touch a little bit more on panels here. So the panels of the saddle are these things right here, okay? Those are the panels. And it's important to talk about that because a lot of panels, so we have foam panels and we have wool panels, and they do different things. So wool panels a lot of times can be reflocked by fitters, and sometimes, and we have a lot more, we can do different things with the panels. So we can make them softer, we can make them harder, okay? Whereas foam panels, they're usually pretty standard in terms of the actual shape that they come in. They're pretty standard in terms of their density. But it's really important to ask, no matter what kind of panel you have, so whether it be foam or wool, is this panel forgiving? So if your horse comes into a jump and slams on the brakes, is that panel going to be too hard to take the impact of that slam on the brakes, okay? Do they hold their shape? So the flip side of that is, are they too mushy? Are they too, do they not, do they have too much shock absorption in them? Because if they have too much shock absorption, you're not going to be able to communicate effectively with your horse, and your horse is going to end up, like, you'll get frustrated, they'll get frustrated. That's just not, it's not fun. If you're just out trail riding, it's probably fine. But even then, I think, you know, communication is really important in developing healthy relationships with, you know, whether it's a horse or, you know, anything. And making sure that you can talk to your horse effectively comes through in the panels. So again, are they too hard? Like, and a quick trick that you can do there too, you can put your saddle with the cantle towards your body on your hip, and then hold the pommel in your hand. And if you walk around and you feel like they're really jabbing into the side of your hip, they're probably too hard, okay? And if you don't feel like you can talk to your horse effectively, then they're probably a little too soft. So it's important to talk about panel, the actual like panel consistency. And in terms of foam panels, I mean, I think foam panels can be too thin sometimes, they can be too hard, they can be too thick, the same way that wool panels can be too hard, too thick, and not forgiving either. Like, it depends per saddle, because we do customize each saddle to each horse, right? Or we attempt to make it as fitted to each horse as possible. Okay, moving on to panel contact. So you can see, you know, panels are a pretty big thing. The tree we're going to talk about after, but the panels is something that you can check directly with your own eyes and with your own hands. So in this lecture, I talk about it a little more. There are definitely other sessions that we do where we talk about trees a bit more, but in this one, this is something that everyone can do regardless of how good their eye is, because it depends on feel. So when we talk about panel contact, we're looking at the even contact, like the evenness of contact between a horse's back and the panels. So that means that if you have a naked saddle on your horse's back, so just the saddle itself, no pad, no half pad, like none of that, okay? And you run your hand from the very top of the saddle here, and so you have to go under this guy. You run it from the top all the way to the bottom over here, okay? You want to look for tight spots. Are there uneven pressure zones? Does it feel just even the whole way? And do you feel like it's not easy to get your hand through, but it's not the end of the world? You know, it's not like you're really putting a lot of muscle in there to get your hand to the back of the saddle, okay? A lot of times you're going to find there's tightness right here in a lot of saddles, and that usually if there is tightness there, it means that your tree is not the right shape, okay, or size. So if your tree is too narrow, you're going to have tightness back here. And if your tree is the wrong shape, a lot of times you have tightness back there, which is not a place you want to be. Like we were talking before about T13 and the thoracic lumbar, you don't want to be putting pressure at the back of your saddle for sure. So the panels essentially translate to the shape of the tree and the fit of the tree on the horse, and it's something that you guys can all do at home. So panel contact, really simple one, and I can demonstrate this all after with a saddle I have here. Really important. Okay, tightness. So the next thing that we check usually, and this is, we'll do it on a horse without a pad, without too much there, just naked on the horse's back. So we look at the top here, we pop our fingers all the way down here, and then we run them this way. And what we want to have is an even contact on the horse's shoulders, okay? You don't want to have, you know, a ton of room, and you also don't want to have it too tight. So if you, and we can also do this one when you're up in the saddle. In the saddle, it's actually probably a better way of checking it than like on a static fit. But what you can do is pop your fingers here even when you're walking, if your horse is safe, okay, and then go for a trot. And if you can keep your fingers between where the horse's shoulder blade or scapula is rotating under the saddle, and if you feel like you can keep them there for an hour, you're fine. If you rip your fingers out when your horse takes your first step because it's painful, then it is definitely too narrow on your horse, okay? And we're going to talk about being too wide on your horse after. You see that happen when there's a pivot. Being too wide is just as bad as being too narrow. We tend to talk about being too narrow a lot more than we talk about being too wide, but we will touch base on the wide after too. Okay, so now that we've kind of done our sort of checks to say, okay, this saddle passes everything in terms of being a good candidate for a saddle that works on the horse, then we're going to go to the motion fit. So that's where we get on the horse and we ride the horse around. Some horses, and the reason it's really important to do a static and a motion fit is because some horses will stand inverted, okay? So they'll stand with more of an arch in their back and then travel with more roundness. So it can change what you're looking for immediately, okay? So a horse that stands really hollow backed or really like arched in its back and then lifts like crazy and just travels through is gonna have a very different saddle than a horse that stands inverted and stays inverted in movement. And so, and just kind of also a small note, I know there are, you know, sometimes it is okay to have a small amount. And when I say small amount, I'm like 5 millimeters of bridging, okay? So a little bit more pressure here and a little bit more pressure there because the horse is gonna come into that zone, okay? So it's basically my take-home message is make sure, just because it fits your horse in the cross ties, it does not mean it's gonna fit in the riding that you do. And you're buying the saddle to ride in it, so make sure it fits while you ride. Yeah, we can touch more a bit on that after. So don't worry, because that's one that we can dive into for an extra 6 hours. So we can come back to that after. Okay. So movement of the saddle. So it's really important. So now that we've done all of our checks, we said, okay, this is good. We know how the horse moves, and we get it into the saddle and we start going around. It's really important to see it in trot, canter, you know, some circles left and right. And if you're jumping over jumps, like you have to see the saddle work as it would in a normal situation, okay? A little bit of movement up and down is okay, especially if it's in a wool saddle that's not like sort of shaped to them yet. But a lot of it is definitely not. So you have to have stability. And as the saddle works harder, so if you have a touch of movement, and like when I say, again, like it's 5 millimeters, right? Like it's not a lot that is just up and down, that's okay. Left to right movement is not okay. If you have left to right movement, the saddle has to be, you know, it's taken off the table. We're going to look at something else. But definitely up and down is a little bit okay, as long as you work harder, that saddle works harder with you. So if you go from trot to canter and the saddle quiets down and it goes onto the horse, especially if you're a jumper, then it's okay to consider it, but it has to be something that works harder with you, and especially that doesn't leave you hanging. So like if you're really, you know, if you have trouble, let's say, downward transitions, and the saddle sort of dumps you in your downward transition in like a level 1 test, then that's not an appropriate saddle for you guys, right? Like it has to work harder and help you guys. That's why we have saddles. It's not always a rider thing. Sometimes it is just you have to find a better saddle. So yeah. And then I get this question a lot. So saddles do move a lot sometimes in the first 5 minutes of a saddle fit. So you have to, each saddle has a different balance point, and because the tree shapes can be different than what you're riding in, especially if you're going from a saddle that's kind of not suited to your horse to one that is, then you've changed your balance point a lot. And the stirrup bars can cause your saddle to pivot a little, so for up and down, not side to side. And that's when, like if you and your coach put a saddle on and it's a used saddle and you've been looking and it checks all the boxes, but there's a bit of movement in the first few minutes, discount it. As long as after 5 minutes that saddle is quiet and it stays quiet for the rest of the ride, okay? Because as soon as you found your new balance point, the saddle should quiet down quite a bit, okay? Girths. Okay, so this is a fun one. Girths are really important. We pretty much don't talk about them, and we should. I think that they're just as important as bits and saddles and bridles, right? Like it's all equipment. And the girth can massively change the way your saddle interacts with your horse. So you have to actually have a girth that fits your saddle and your horse. And just because you have one girth that works on one saddle doesn't mean that the next saddle and the next girth, and the girth is going to work the same on the next saddle. And this one is definitely, specific girths for specific horses, and it depends on the horse's sensitivities. So like horses that are really like thin-skinned or very sensitive, I like sheepskin. I think it's a really natural product. It works well with them. They are comfortable in it. With the workload is definitely a very important thing. Like if you have a horse that is working, 6 days a week, for sure, you cannot have anything digging into them or grabbing their hair. Whereas if you have a horse that's working once a week, you can get away with a bit more. And then, like we had said before, the girth and groove, so that section on the horse, actually right up here, that can change quite a bit per horse, okay? And how your saddle fits. So that's another one that we could probably do 6 hours on, but we're not going to today. So because we have to keep it short and sweet, and I think things that, everyone can use at home, which is important. So the last one that I'm going to talk about is the rider's position. So a lot of people, I think, it's not part, when we look at saddle fit, we're like, a lot of coaches actually, I would say, are very cognizant of rider's position because that's what they work on. But as riders ourselves, when we're shopping for saddles, we don't talk about our position too much. And it is something that is so key to good saddle fit. So you have conformation the same way that your horse has conformation, and you have to be properly fit in your saddle for the saddle, for your position to be good and for the saddle to fit your horse properly. If you sort of dive into it more, it makes sense, right? Like riders need to be balanced for horses to be balanced. An unbalanced rider is definitely an unbalanced horse, unless the horse is, a $250,000 horse. And we also want to be effective. So if we're comfortable ourselves and we're in a good position, then we're definitely more effective. Sort of a little bit, on the conformation, like there are different shapes of hips out there. Just because you're a man doesn't mean that you're going to go in a certain shape of twist, and just because you're a woman doesn't mean that, like, it's individual the same way that each horse is individual to each saddle, okay? And your comfort long-term is just as important as your horse's comfort long-term. This is a sport that we do, a lot of times, like I have lots of clients in their 70s, I have some in their 80s, and you only get there and you only continue to do this sport if you are comfortable and if your back is healthy and your hips are healthy. And one way that we do that is by making sure that the saddle fits you and your hips and the twist. And then your horse is a lot happier a lot of times too, because though the position that you maintain dictates forwardness, impulsion, lightness, it's really important. So it's one thing I wish people would spend a little bit more time when they're at home analyzing their own saddles is their actual position. Because sometimes a well-fit saddle, it's not going to, like, you have to, your position is so, like, it's hand in hand, if that makes sense. And we'll dive into this one probably more in the question period too, because it's so important. So just make sure that if you don't feel good and the saddle fits your horse, then have a really frank conversation with your coach as to whether it's something that you think is in you or in the saddle. And if you don't think that you can get there with that saddle, don't buy it, because in a year your back will be painful. You'll have to sell it. It's worth looking for the right saddle that helps you and your horse. Okay, so now that we've kind of done, the motion fit and the static fit and your position and girths and all that, you guys are ready to saddle shop. So there's definitely, you can saddle shop by yourself, you can saddle shop with companies, you can saddle shop with saddle fitters, you can do it a million different ways. And it's really important, either which way that you do it, it's important to look at, is your horse going to change? And, how do we find them? And what are the real costs of it? So without further ado, in saddle fit, we will look at, when you're working with a rep or a fitter or anyone really, they're going to look at the static and motion fits. Okay, they're going to do a tracing. I'll show you what that is in a second. They're going to look at the horse's shape, and then they're going to find a tree shape, or you're going to find a tree shape. The type of saddle is really important too. And then fitting you also, that's a big one as well. Okay, so those are all different tools that we're going to use to accomplish to make sure everyone's comfortable. Okay, so this is one way of doing a tracing. There's lots of different ways to do tracings out there, but this is just, one. And when we look at a tracing, sometimes it's fun because you can track changes. So a lot of people will ask me, can a horse's shape really change? And it's funny because in the dressage world, I think people know that the horses change a lot because they're all, a different movement is a different set of muscles. And so your horse is changing in a different way each time. Whereas in the jumpers, hunters, and eventers, it's a very similar movement throughout the levels, right? So it's not like you're schooling, let's say, extended trot to canter pirouette. You're schooling a 2-foot jump to 1.40 meters. And yes, those muscles are going to get bigger. But definitely horses' backs can change. How much they change depends on a lot. So this was a really interesting case because this was a imported Grand Prix dressage horse. And she was from Germany, brought over to Canada, 10-year-old mare. You would not think that this horse was going to change significantly. So this was the original, this one here was the original tracing when she arrived. So that black line, okay? And then the black line there. And so this point here corresponds to her wither. This is sort of the base of the wither, okay? And that's right there. And then the 5th point there is the back of the saddle, or like the end of where your bottom would sit, I guess would be more appropriate. So in, a textbook case, someone would say, okay, imported horse, Grand Prix, not, probably not going to change. It's a 10-year-old mare. Well, this horse went from narrow to medium wide in 6 months. Okay. And not only did the horse go from narrow to medium wide, her actual tree shape, the shape that she needed, changed as well, because her musculature on her hind end changed so much from being ridden more effectively, and I would say probably a lot more comfortable tack as well. So this is something, like, your horses can change. It's not like, if I had looked at this horse, I probably would have said she might go to medium, narrow to medium in 6 months, not narrow to medium wide. They can change. And like, you can see the amount of development in her hind end there, right? And even in her shoulders, there's a lot of development too. So yes, they can change. And that kind of puts us on to our next topic, which is predicting change. Like, how do fitters predict change? How do you know how much is enough and all that? And the reality is that, like, we're going to use tracings. We're going to look at your horse's bloodlines. We're going to look at, whatever we can, and also your own program. Like, programs tend to create very similar types of horses. Okay. So we have to use everything available to us, but at the end of the day, we don't have a crystal glass. It is hard to predict change, but can you do it kind of from an empirical standpoint? A little bit, but it's also a bit of an art too. So with you and your coach, usually you guys can figure out a little bit of it, but it also depends, like, your dedication to or not dedication, I shouldn't say, but like, someone who works their horse 6 days a week is gonna, and consistently for 6 months, is going to have very different results than someone who does, 6 days a week every 3 weeks, and then 2 days a week for 2 weeks. And, if there's a lot of change in your own program, there's going to be a lot of change in your own horse's back, but it might not always be positive. Whereas if there's, a consistent program, you'll probably have more results delivered in a positive fashion. So like anything, right? Okay. And then, so horses' backs can change, but what do we do about it? Like, do we, our saddle's really adjustable, and should I buy an adjustable saddle if I know my horse's back is going to change? I think that one's a tough question, because I think there are definitely, it depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I would say there are 2 kinds of saddles. So there are saddles that are adjustable in the width of tree. So that would be like Bates or Santa Cruz, or, those brands. I think Pessoa does a few too. I wouldn't say, like, you're just changing the width. You're not changing the actual shape. And like, on this horse in particular, if we had just changed the width, would that have done that much? Probably not, because she also had this increase in musculature in her hind end, okay? So she also needed a change of shape, not just a change of tree width. So I think that there are adjustable saddles out there, like those brands. But then if you look at, like, so for example, we carry Amerigo. It's a very, very good brand. And it is adjustable, but it's just as adjustable as a Devaku or as a Butte. Like, anything with an iron head has the same amount of adjustability throughout the brands, okay? And it's like a paper clip or a bobby pin. If you, like, an iron head in the tree is the iron head actually sits here, and that's what we talk about when we talk about tree points. And if you stretch a paper clip and you open it and then you close it, and you open it and close it, open it and close it, you're gonna snap your iron head, okay? These things are not made to be stretched or closed or opened. You can adjust them a little bit, and you can adjust them, you know, to a certain degree, it's possible, but it's not something you should be doing every 6 months. Your saddle, for the integrity, these, and you know, when I talk about a lot of the saddles I talk about too, I am talking about the, you know, the high-end brands, because that's what I work with, but they're designed to last 20, 25 years. Okay, these are not saddles that are designed to last 5 years, but they only last that long, the 20, 25 years, if you don't adjust the trees all the time. Okay, so I look at saddles, you know, to me, a lot of times I think of them as, it's like a trailer, they hold their value. Okay, so in terms of with this horse, we did change her saddle, okay, because it wouldn't have made sense for us to just open the tree here and then not talk about this end part of her, right? So we changed her saddle, and the saddle held its value that way. And yeah, but it can be done. So it can be done. Just keep in mind, it's, you know, probably maximum 3 times in its lifetime is safe. And when you open up a tree, you have to be really, really aware of how much, are you stretching the tree evenly or is it uneven? I see a lot of twisted trees in our industry, and I also see a lot of broken trees. So one way that you can avoid that is like limit your tree changes or your tree stretching and compressions to, you know, 3 times maximum in the saddle's lifetime. There are other things that you can do to make your saddle adjustable. Changing the panels does not affect your integrity of saddle. I find it's a really good one. It's a quick one. The saddle's not gone for weeks on end. And, you know, and be okay with the idea that, like, yeah, your saddle should fit. If the horse is in a program, it should fit. It's not like it should change drastically. But if you know the saddle is going to change, be prepared for it and account for that in your budget, and take good care of your saddles, because you can get pretty close to what you paid for them when you sell them, right? Okay, so now that let's talk about accessing these quality saddles. So a quality saddle is any saddle that fits you and your horse and makes them comfortable. That's as simple as it is for me, is if it's something that is going to last long term and is comfortable for both of you, then it's a quality saddle. So I always tell people, like we were saying before, test your trees, because we do adjust trees a lot in Canada, and it's really important. Like, we have a consignment section of our company, and you wouldn't believe how many saddles come in that are cracked. So what you can do, I can show you that after, but you're going to take the cantle, put it against your stomach, and then hold the pommel and gently pull. And if you hear any squeaks or anything weird that you can hear in that saddle, you shouldn't hear it, and it shouldn't pop, okay? If you're buying a saddle, ask someone to do that. Ask the person selling it to show you that it's not cracked. And then you're also going to pop it between your knees and press on the tree points. And even if you're buying from a saddle fitter, get them to confirm, or someone who was in saddles. Like, it's important to check your saddles, okay? You can also look for crooked trees. If you don't feel like your horse can side pass left as well as it can do right, look for a crooked tree. So sometimes and a lot of times, yeah, the horses, like us, we have a stronger side, right? But sometimes it is because the trees are crooked, okay? Uneven paneling, that's something that we see a little bit more often in wool saddles than we do in foam panels. You want to make sure that the saddle fits your horse, okay? And that the panels fit your horse. So now you've found this saddle, and it passes all the tests, and it's good for the horse, it's good for you, it's intact. Let's look at a good way to get a good deal on a saddle is you have to know what you're looking for. You have to do your homework. There's, Facebook is a great place to find saddles. So is Kijiji sometimes, but I find Facebook is probably a little bit better. Ask your friends. So you would not believe how many people have a saddle sitting in their basement that they're not using. So if you're on a tight budget, ask around and ask people's grandmas, because if you have friends whose grandmas rode, chances are they have a saddle in their basement. Be polite. So that's something that like you wouldn't think that we would have to say in this day and age, but definitely like, no, it's fine to know what you want, but if you're polite, the person is going to be more amenable to you, you know, maybe getting a better deal. And then be ready to purchase and be straight up. Say, look, I've got $3,000 to spend today. If you have something that's right, and I can pretty much guarantee you, you're going to get a good deal. Whereas if you maybe, you know, start looking early, and it's fine to start looking early, but just be very honest with people as well. In terms of pricing saddles, so if you're going to sell your own saddle, a good way of kind of figuring out sort of where it should sit is if you depreciate it 5% a year. Because if a saddle is supposed to last 20 years, that means it's going to lose about 5% of its value a year. So that's, you know, $200 to $300 a year. And that's a good way of doing it there. So, and then too, if you think something's a bit high, just ask them what, or look up on the internet too, what the original price of the saddle was. And you can do it that way. The brands that don't last 20 years depreciate, you know, at 10% a year, but in general, like, a lot of the higher end brands are meant to last a long time. Okay. And two, we can maybe talk about that. You guys can email me about that, but, certain brands over the years have been bought and sold by different people. So sometimes the older saddles are actually better saddles than the newer ones. And that's one that, yeah, feel free if you guys want to talk about that later. It's just interesting. Like, saddle companies are companies, and they do get bought and sold. So to be a little bit aware of that too. A 20-year-old saddle can be better than a new saddle sometimes, especially if it fits you and your horse. Go with the 20-year-old saddle. Okay, so now that you've kind of done all that, the real cost of a good saddle at the end of the day is your horse is going to stay healthier. So its proper movement and sport leads to less compensation and injury long term. That is a fact that we know, and we know it across multiple sports. It's not just in, you know, horses. We know it in track. We know it, you know, we know it in pretty much everything. We're going to have better rides. Your horse is going to be happier because you're riding better. You're happier. Your coach is happier because they're not telling you to quiet your lower leg. Everyone's happier. And it is an immediate payoff. Like, you are going to spend less money on maintenance simply because those joints are being, there's less torsion on a joint, and there's less, you know, there's less negative effects on each joint. And then pride of ownership. Like, we definitely all want our best for our horses, and it's important to us that they feel good too. So they're, you know, the payoff is pretty immediate with a good saddle. You can reach us this way at any time.